Section 1. The dimly lit bar pulsed with quiet energy, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside Claire Thompson. The warm, amber glow from the overhead lights reflected off the polished wooden bar, catching the glint of her untouched glass of whiskey. She had been nursing the drink for the past 15 minutes, unable to bring herself to take the first sip. Her mind was a battlefield, emotions clashing in a chaotic mess that she couldn't seem to sort through. She had sworn she wouldn't drink tonight, sworn she wouldn't let the events of the past week consume her, and yet, here she was, sitting in a bar far from her usual spots, alone, staring into the golden depths of the liquor like it held the answers to all of her problems. The betrayal still stung sharp and unrelenting. Her ex-boyfriend hadn't just moved on, he had moved on with her best friend. And the worst part? Everyone had known before she did. The pitying glances, the awkward silences, the half-hearted attempts at comfort all made sense now. She had been living in ignorance while the people she trusted most had been making a fool of her. Her grip on the glass tightened. She should have seen the signs, the late nights, the sudden cancellations, the way he'd always been too tired to see her, but somehow had the energy to take another woman on a weekend getaway. But she hadn't wanted to believe it, because believing it meant accepting that the life she had spent the past 3 years building had been a lie. Claire exhaled slowly, finally lifting the glass to her lips. The whiskey burned as it slid down her throat, a sharp contrast to the numbness that had settled in her chest. She set the glass down with more force than necessary, the sound barely audible over the soft hum of conversations around her. Rough night. The deep, smooth voice sent a shiver down her spine. She hadn't even noticed anyone sitting beside her, too lost in her own thoughts to care about anything or anyone else. But now her attention was drawn to the man at her side. She turned her head slightly, her gaze locking onto piercing blue eyes. The man was tall, dressed in a dark, well-tailored suit that screamed wealth and power. His sharp jawline, tousled dark hair, and the way he held himself with quiet confidence made him look like he belonged in a magazine rather than a dimly lit bar. Claire wasn't in the mood for company, but something about him, his presence, the way he looked at her with curiosity rather than pity, made her hesitate. "You could say that," she murmured, turning back to her drink. He studied her for a moment, then took a slow sip of his own whiskey. "Want to talk about it?" She let out a humorless chuckle. "What, so you can offer some wise, philosophical advice about how life gets better and heartbreak makes you stronger?" His lips twitched in amusement. "I was going to offer you another drink, but if you'd prefer a lecture, I could probably come up with something." Despite herself, Claire felt the corners of her mouth lift slightly. It wasn't much, but it was the first real hint of a smile she had managed in days. He nodded toward her glass. "That drink isn't working, is it?" She sighed, shaking her head. "Not enough of it in the world to fix this night." He tilted his head as if considering her words. "Then maybe you need something else." Claire arched an eyebrow. "Like what?" He smirked. "A distraction." Her heart did an odd little jump. The last thing she needed was to get involved with another man, especially one who looked like he could break her heart without even trying. But tonight she didn't want to think, she didn't want to feel, and he was offering her an escape. "Just for tonight," she found herself saying, her voice barely above a whisper. His gaze darkened as if he had been waiting for those exact words. Just for tonight. The hotel room was bathed in soft moonlight, the curtains swaying slightly from the night breeze. Claire's breath was shallow as she stood near the bed, her pulse racing. The man, whose name she still didn't know, watched her with an intensity that made her knees weak. "This isn't like me," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. His eyes softened, but there was still a fire behind them. "Me neither." That was the last thing either of them said before he closed the space between them. The morning light streamed through the windows, warming Claire's bare skin. The sound of steady breathing beside her reminded her that last night hadn't been a dream. Panic clawed at her throat as she carefully turned her head, taking in the sight of the man sleeping beside her. He looked different in the daylight, more vulnerable somehow. She bit her lip, realizing how reckless she had been. One night, that was the deal, no names, no complications. Carefully, she slipped out of bed, gathered her clothes, and dressed as quietly as possible. She needed to leave before she did something stupid, like ask him to stay. With one last glance at the stranger who had given her the distraction she needed, Claire slipped out the door. She had no idea that this night would change her life forever. 3 months later, Claire stood in front of the bathroom mirror, her hands trembling as she clutched the pregnancy test. The two pink lines stared back at her, confirming what she had been dreading for weeks. Pregnant. A strangled laugh escaped her lips, tinged with disbelief. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. She sank onto the edge of the bathtub, her mind racing. She had been so careful. It had only been one night, one reckless, impulsive night. And now, her breath hitched. She didn't even know his name. She had never once thought about tracking him down after that night. He had been a fleeting moment, a mistake she had chosen to leave in the past. But now, that mistake had consequences. What was she going to do? Her fingers tightened around the test as reality came crashing down. She was going to be a mother. She was going to have a baby. Alone. Tears burned her eyes, but she blinked them away. She had survived worse. She could do this. For her child, she would do anything. Claire's hands shook as she sorted through job listings, her heart sinking with each rejection email that came in. She had been working as a freelance designer, but with a baby on the way, she needed something stable, something secure. Her eyes landed on a posting for a design position at a prestigious company, King Enterprises. It was a long shot, but she had nothing to lose. She clicked apply. She had no idea that walking into that interview would change everything, that she would come face to face with the father of her child, that the man she had spent one unforgettable night with was Adrian King, the billionaire CEO. Section 2. Claire's heart pounded as she stood outside the towering glass building of King Enterprises. The name alone was intimidating, a symbol of power and prestige. The moment she had received the email inviting her for an interview, she had almost convinced herself not to go. But with a child on the way, she couldn't afford to let fear hold her back. She took a deep breath, placed a protective hand over her still flat stomach, and walked through the revolving doors. The lobby was sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that let in just the right amount of light to make the entire space feel both grand and impersonal. Employees in sharp business attire walked past her with purposeful strides, their conversations hushed but filled with importance. Claire swallowed hard. She didn't belong here. She adjusted her blazer, hoping it would make her look more professional, and walked toward the reception desk. "Hi, I'm Claire Thompson. I have an interview for the lead graphic designer position," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The receptionist, a polished woman with dark-rimmed glasses, gave her a once-over before nodding. "Of course, Miss Thompson. You're scheduled to meet with Mr. King himself. Please take the elevator to the 30th floor." Claire blinked. Mr. King himself? She had assumed the interview would be with the hiring manager or the creative director. Why would the CEO personally interview someone for a graphic design role? But she didn't have time to overthink it. Instead, she nodded, murmured a polite thank you, and made her way toward the elevators. As the doors closed, trapping her in the sleek steel box, she took a deep breath. She needed to focus. This was her chance to secure a future for herself and her child. The elevator ride felt both too long and too short, and before she knew it, the doors slid open to reveal a pristine executive floor. The air felt different here, quieter, more serious. She stepped out, glancing around for any sign of where to go next. A woman in a navy blue suit approached her, clipboard in hand. "Miss Thompson?" "Yes," Claire replied. "Follow me, please. Mr. King will see you now." Her stomach twisted. There was something about the way the woman said it that made Claire feel as if she were walking into a courtroom rather than a job interview. She squared her shoulders and followed the woman through a set of double doors. The office was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. A sleek desk sat near the center, but Claire barely registered any of it. Because the man behind the desk, the one looking over a stack of documents with a furrowed brow, was him, her mysterious stranger from that unforgettable night, Adrian King. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't happening. This had to be some kind of cruel joke. But then he lifted his head, those piercing blue eyes meeting hers, and the slight narrowing of his gaze told her everything. He recognized her. A tense silence filled the room as they stared at each other, both frozen in shock. Adrian was the first to recover. Slowly, he placed the papers down and leaned back in his chair, regarding her with an unreadable expression. "Miss Thompson," he said smoothly, though there was an unmistakable sharpness to his tone. "I wasn't expecting you." Claire's pulse raced. He wasn't just some stranger she had spent one reckless night with. He was Adrian King, one of the most powerful CEOs in the country. And now he was the man who held her future in his hands. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to regain her composure. I wasn't expecting this either. Adrian studied her, his sharp gaze flicking over her as if trying to solve a puzzle. Then, he gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Sit. Claire hesitated for half a second before lowering herself onto the chair, clasping her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. This is unexpected, Adrian said, tilting his head slightly. Understatement of the year. Claire forced herself to nod. Yes, but I applied for this job because I'm qualified, and I'd appreciate it if we could keep this professional. His lips pressed together as if considering her words. Professional? Her stomach twisted. There was something about the way he said it that sent shivers down her spine. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with unspoken words, with memories neither of them had expected to resurface. Then Adrian exhaled and leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. Tell me why you want this job, Claire. He had said her name so casually, yet it sent her heart into a frenzy. She clenched her hands tighter. Because I need it, she admitted. I have experience in branding and design, and I believe I can bring a fresh perspective to King Enterprises. Adrian didn't blink. And the fact that we've met before, it doesn't change anything, she lied. Something flashed in his eyes, something unreadable. Is that so? Claire nodded firmly, yes. Another beat of silence passed before Adrian exhaled and leaned back in his chair. Fine. Then let's proceed with the interview. She wasn't sure if she had just won or lost this battle. 30 minutes later, Claire left the office with her heart still pounding. The interview had gone well, better than she had expected given the circumstances. Adrian hadn't treated her any differently than he would have any other candidate. But the way he had looked at her, the way his eyes had lingered just a little too long, told her that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That night, Claire lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her thoughts a tangled mess. How had she ended up here? What were the odds that the man she had spent one impulsive night with would be her new boss? And most importantly, how was she going to tell him about the baby? Her hand instinctively moved to her stomach. She had planned to raise this child alone. She had never even considered tracking Adrian down. But now, fate had thrown them together in a way she could never have predicted. And sooner or later he would find out the truth. The question was, would he hate her for keeping it a secret? Or would he fight to be a part of their child's life? She had no idea. But one thing was certain. Her carefully built plan had just been shattered, and she had no idea how to fix it. Section 3. Claire couldn't shake the unease that clung to her like a second skin. The moment she had stepped out of King Enterprises, her mind had been in complete turmoil. She had somehow managed to make it through the interview, maintaining a professional front despite Adrian King's piercing gaze dissecting her every move. But deep down, she knew, this was just the beginning. Adrian wasn't a fool. He had recognized her immediately. Even if he had acted as though nothing had happened between them, she had seen the flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. Suspicion. And it terrified her. She spent the next few days checking her phone anxiously, waiting for a response from King Enterprises. The longer she waited, the more she convinced herself that she wouldn't get the job. Maybe Adrian had decided she was too much of a complication. Maybe he didn't want a reminder of that night in his company. Then, on the fourth evening, just as she was preparing dinner, her phone rang. The number flashing on her screen sent her heart into a frenzy. King Enterprises. Claire hesitated for a moment before answering. Hello? Miss Thompson. A crisp female voice greeted her. This is Rebecca Monroe from Mr. King's office. We're pleased to inform you that you've been selected for the lead graphic designer position. Congratulations. Claire nearly dropped the phone. She had gotten the job. A mixture of relief and dread swirled in her chest. Thank you, she managed to say. Mr. King would like you to report to the office first thing Monday morning to finalize your onboarding paperwork. Is that acceptable? She swallowed hard. Yes, of course, I'll be there. Great, we'll see you then. The line disconnected. Claire stared at her phone for a long moment. What had just happened? She should be celebrating. This was exactly what she had wanted. A stable job, a good salary, security for her child. But the fact that Adrian was the one signing her paychecks complicated everything. Why had he hired her? Did he suspect something? Or was he really willing to act as if they were nothing more than employer and employee? She didn't have an answer, but she had a feeling she was about to find out. Monday morning came too quickly. Claire had barely slept the night before, anxiety twisting in her stomach as she imagined every possible scenario. She tried to remind herself that she wasn't the same woman she had been that night. She wasn't some heartbroken fool looking for a reckless escape. She was a professional, a soon-to-be mother, and she wasn't going to let Adrian King intimidate her. She dressed in a fitted blazer and pencil skirt, ensuring she looked polished and confident. Then, she made her way to King Enterprises. The moment she stepped inside the building, the energy shifted. She wasn't just another interviewee anymore. She was an employee. She checked in at the front desk, and a different receptionist greeted her this time. "Miss Thompson, welcome to King Enterprises. Mr. King asked that you meet with him before heading to HR. His office is on the 30th floor. Claire's stomach lurched. She had to meet with him first? She forced herself to nod, keeping her expression neutral. "Thank you." As she rode the elevator up, she tried to keep her nerves in check. She had survived the interview. She could survive this, too. When the doors slid open, she was greeted by Rebecca Monroe, the same assistant who had called her. "Right this way," Rebecca said, leading her down the hallway. The closer they got to Adrian's office, the heavier Claire's steps felt. Then, before she was ready, the door was pushed open. "Mr. King, Miss Thompson is here." Adrian was standing by the window, his back to them, hands in his pockets. The morning light cast sharp shadows along the tailored lines of his charcoal suit. At Rebecca's words, he turned. Claire's breath caught. He was as devastatingly handsome as she remembered. But today, there was something even colder about him. "Leave us," Adrian said smoothly. Rebecca hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Of course, sir." She exited the room, closing the door behind her. Silence stretched between them. Adrian studied her with an unreadable expression before finally speaking. "Sit." Claire lowered herself into the chair across from his desk, her fingers curling against her skirt to keep them from trembling. "Why did you apply here?" Adrian asked. His voice was deceptively calm, but there was something dangerous about it. Claire held his gaze. "Because I needed a job. Out of all the companies in the city, you just happened to choose mine." Her stomach twisted. "King Enterprises has an excellent reputation. It's one of the best places for someone in my field." Adrian leaned forward slightly, his piercing blue eyes never leaving hers. "I don't believe in coincidences, Claire." She swallowed. "It's not a coincidence." His jaw clenched slightly. "Then what is it?" She forced herself to keep her voice steady. "A necessity." Adrian studied her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, a small smirk curved his lips. "Fine," he said. "You're here now. Let's see if you can keep up." She blinked. "What?" "You're officially employed, Miss Thompson. I expect nothing but excellence. Can you deliver that?" Claire's breath hitched. This was unexpected. Adrian wasn't pressing her about the past. He wasn't asking about that night. It was almost as if he was daring her to prove herself. She straightened her spine. "Yes." His smirk deepened. "Good. Human Resources will handle the paperwork. Report to the design team afterward. Dismissed." Claire hesitated for only a second before standing. "Thank you, Mr. King." She turned to leave, but before she could reach the door, his voice stopped her. "One more thing, Claire." She turned back. Adrian's eyes darkened slightly. "You're hiding something." Her breath stilled. "I don't know what it is," he continued, tilting his head slightly. "But I'll find out." A chill ran down her spine. She forced herself to nod stiffly. Then, without another word, she walked out of the office. Her heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. Adrian King was onto her, and she had no idea how long she could keep the truth from him. Section 4. Claire's entire body felt rigid as she walked down the hallway, her heels clicking against the pristine marble floors of King Enterprises. Adrian's words echoed in her mind. "You're hiding something. I don't know what it is, but I'll find out." Her heart was still racing. It had been a warning, a promise. Adrian King wasn't a man who left questions unanswered. And now that she was under his employment, it was only a matter of time before he started digging deeper. She had to be careful. With a deep breath, Claire pushed aside her anxiety and focused on the present. She had a job to do. She reached the HR department where a friendly woman named Mia Brooks greeted her. "Ah, Miss Thompson. Welcome to King Enterprises. Let's get you settled in, shall we?" Claire nodded, doing her best to push aside her unease. Mia guided her through the onboarding process. Contracts, benefits, security access. It was a standard procedure, and yet, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Her gaze flickered toward the glass walls of the HR department. Through them, she could see Adrian's office in the distance. His blinds were slightly open, and he was watching her. Her breath hitched, but instead of looking away, Adrian simply held her gaze, as if daring her to acknowledge what they both knew. She was keeping a secret, and he wasn't going to stop until he uncovered it. Claire quickly turned back to the paperwork, pretending not to notice the way her hands trembled slightly. By the time she finished in HR, her nerves were frayed. Mia gave her a reassuring smile. "You'll be reporting to the creative department on the 15th floor. Your team lead, Jake Carter, is expecting you." Claire nodded. "Thank you." She took the elevator down, smoothing out the wrinkles in her blouse. She needed to focus. Whatever tension was brewing between her and Adrian, she couldn't let it interfere with her work. The moment she stepped into the creative department, the atmosphere shifted. Unlike the cold, polished floors of the executive level, this area was lively. The space was open concept, filled with sleek desks, oversized monitors, and massive whiteboards covered in sketches and notes. A group of employees huddled around a presentation screen, discussing a new branding campaign. This was where she belonged. Before she could take another step, a cheerful voice called out, "You must be Claire." She turned to see a man in his mid-30s approaching with an easygoing smile. His dark brown hair was slightly tousled, and he wore a fitted blazer over a plain t-shirt. "Jake Carter," he introduced himself, extending a hand. "I'm the head of the design team." Claire shook his hand. "Claire Thompson, nice to meet you." Jake grinned. "We're excited to have you on board. Your portfolio was impressive." "Thank you," she said, relieved by his warmth. Jake led her to an empty desk. "This will be your workspace. Feel free to personalize it." She nodded, settling in. For the first time since stepping into King Enterprises, she felt, okay, maybe she could actually make this work. The next few hours flew by. Claire familiarized herself with the team's current projects, diving into branding concepts and campaign strategies. She was in the middle of reviewing design drafts when Jake leaned over. "So," he said in a conspiratorial whisper, "what's your secret?" Claire blinked. "Excuse me?" Jake smirked. "Everyone has a reason for joining King Enterprises. Some are here to boost their resumes, some are here for the ridiculous salary, and some," he wiggled his eyebrows, "are here for the boss." Claire's throat went dry. Was it that obvious? Jake chuckled. "Relax, I was just messing with you. You looked like you saw a ghost when you left the CEO's office this morning." She forced a laugh. "I was just nervous. It's not every day you meet a billionaire face to face." Jake tilted his head as if studying her. "Yeah," he said slowly. "I guess that makes sense." Claire quickly changed the subject. "So, how long have you worked here?" 5 years, Jake replied. "Best and worst decision of my life." She raised an eyebrow. "Why the worst?" Jake chuckled. "Because working under Adrian King is like training with a drill sergeant. The man expects perfection." Claire bit her lip. She knew that all too well. "Still," Jake continued, "he's not unfair. He pushes hard, but he rewards talent. If you impress him, you'll go far." Claire forced a smile. "I'll keep that in mind." By the time the workday ended, Claire felt exhausted. She packed up her things, ready to head home, when her phone vibrated. A message. Her heart stopped, and it was from an unknown number, and it read, "We need to talk. Meet me in my office now, AK." Claire's breath hitched. She didn't need to guess who AK was. Adrian. 15 minutes later, Claire stood outside his office, gathering her courage. The doors were closed. She took a deep breath before knocking. "Come in," his voice called. She stepped inside. Adrian was behind his desk, his suit jacket discarded, his sleeves rolled up. He looked as sharp as ever, but his expression was unreadable. "Close the door," he said. She did. Silence hung between them. Adrian leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Why didn't you tell me?" Claire's stomach dropped. She swallowed hard. "Tell you what?" Adrian's eyes darkened. "That night, the hotel. You should have told me." Her fingers curled against her palms. She had known this moment would come. She just hadn't expected it this soon. "You left," she said quietly. Adrian's jaw tensed. "I had to," he said. Claire let out a bitter laugh. "And now you think I owed you an explanation?" His gaze was unreadable. "Are you carrying my child?" The words cut through the air like a blade. Claire's breath caught. This was it. She had spent months preparing for this confrontation. But now that it was happening, she didn't know what to say. Adrian watched her carefully. Then he spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. "Claire, if that baby is mine, you don't get to keep it from me." Her heart pounded so hard it hurt. She knew this was coming. She had known from the moment she saw him again. But what scared her the most? The look in his eyes. Because for the first time since their paths had crossed again, Adrian King didn't look like a ruthless billionaire. He looked like a man who was afraid of losing something he never knew he had. Section 5. Claire's pulse pounded in her ears. She had imagined this conversation 1,000 times. But now, standing in Adrian's office with the weight of his piercing stare locking her in place, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't prepared at all. Adrian had just spoken the words she had feared the most. "Claire, if that baby is mine, you don't get to keep it from me." Her throat was dry, her mind was racing. She had two choices, lie or tell the truth. But the truth would ruin everything. Adrian King was powerful, relentless, and obsessive. If he found out the truth, he wouldn't let this go. He wouldn't let her go. And she couldn't let that happen. Claire forced herself to meet his gaze, her nails digging into her palm. "I don't know what you're talking about." Adrian's jaw ticked. His fingers curled into his desk, his knuckles turning white. "Don't lie to me." His voice was controlled, low, dangerous. Claire lifted her chin, willing herself to appear calm. "I'm not lying. You're making assumptions." Adrian leaned back in his chair, studying her. His dark eyes bore into her, searching for cracks in her composure. Then, after a long pause, he exhaled sharply and stood up. In a single step, he closed the distance between them. Claire instinctively took a step back, but Adrian didn't stop. She could feel the heat radiating off him, the intensity in his gaze as he towered over her. "You expect me to believe that after everything?" His voice was cold, but there was something else. Something raw, something vulnerable. Claire swallowed hard. She had to end this. "That night meant nothing," she said. "You don't have to concern yourself with my life. I applied for this job because I needed it, not because of you. So if you could just—" "Nothing." Adrian's voice dropped even lower, his expression unreadable. Claire forced herself to keep speaking. "Yes, nothing. I moved on. You should too." For a second, silence stretched between them. Then, before she could react, Adrian laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "You moved on?" He took another step closer. "Then why do you look like you're about to run?" Claire stiffened. She hated that he could read her so easily. She hated that even now, her body betrayed her, her heart hammering in her chest, her breath uneven, her fingers trembling just slightly at her sides. Adrian smirked, but it wasn't amused, it was cold, calculated. "You can lie all you want, Claire," he murmured. "But I don't believe in coincidences. You showing up here, in my company, after disappearing for 2 years?" His gaze darkened. "You're hiding something, and I will find out what it is." Claire's stomach dropped. He wouldn't let this go. She needed to make sure he never found out the truth. The moment Claire stepped out of Adrian's office, her hands were shaking. She stormed into the nearest empty corridor, pressing her palm against the cool wall. Breathe. Think. He suspected something, that much was clear. She had to be careful, more careful than she had ever been. She couldn't let Adrian dig too deep, because if he did, he would find out about Elliot. And that was not an option. A voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Hey, new girl." Claire turned sharply, masking her panic. Jake Carter stood a few feet away, his usual easygoing smirk in place. "You look like you just walked out of a war zone," he noted. Claire forced a smile. "I'm fine, just first-day nerves." Jake tilted his head, unconvinced. "Right, first-day nerves. And totally not the fact that you just walked out of Adrian King's office." Claire stiffened. "What?" Jake let out a short laugh. "Oh, come on. Everyone in this company knows how intimidating he is. But you?" He raised an eyebrow. "You don't seem like the type to be scared of him." Claire forced herself to relax. This was good. If people thought she was just another employee trying to survive working under Adrian, it would keep suspicion off her. She shrugged. "He's my boss. I just want to make a good impression." Jake grinned. "Well, good luck with that. Just a tip. He never praises people. If you survive without getting fired in the first month, that's basically his way of saying, 'Good job.'" Claire chuckled. "I'll keep that in mind." Jake gave her an approving nod. "Come on, let's grab lunch. I'll introduce you to the team." She followed him, pushing down the unease still swirling in her stomach. She needed to focus. She needed to stay under the radar, but deep down, she knew it wasn't going to be that easy. That evening, Claire finally arrived home, exhaustion weighing her down. The moment she walked into the small apartment, she heard the soft sound of laughter. Her chest tightened. She made her way to the living room where she found her son, Elliot, sitting on the floor, giggling as her best friend Sophie tickled him. Elliot, her entire world. The reason she had fought so hard for this job. The reason she couldn't afford to let Adrian King find out the truth. The moment Elliot saw her, his eyes lit up. "Mommy!" Claire dropped her bag and instantly scooped him up into her arms, holding him close. She pressed a kiss to his forehead. "Did you have fun with Aunt Sophie today?" Elliot nodded enthusiastically. "We played pirates, and I was the captain." Claire laughed, her heart aching with love. "Of course you were." Sophie stood up, giving Claire a knowing look. "Rough first day?" Claire sighed. "You have no idea." Sophie didn't hesitate. "He recognized you, didn't he?" Claire's throat tightened. "Yes." Sophie's expression darkened. "Claire, you need to leave that job. It's too risky." Claire shook her head. "I can't. We need the money. And if I quit now, it'll look suspicious." Sophie exhaled sharply. "So what's your plan?" Claire looked down at Elliot, watching as he played with a toy car in her arms. Then she met Sophie's gaze. "My plan is to make sure Adrian never finds out Elliot is his." Sophie looked at her like she was insane. But Claire was dead serious. She had to protect her son, at all costs, even if it meant going up against Adrian King himself. Section 6. Claire barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Adrian's face, the piercing gaze, the barely contained suspicion, the quiet yet undeniable sense of possession in his voice. "You're hiding something, and I will find out what it is." Her stomach twisted. For 2 years, she had carefully built this life, a quiet, peaceful world where it was just her and Elliot, a world where she never had to think about Adrian King. But now she was back in his world, and if she wasn't careful, everything she had fought for would come crashing down. Claire forced herself to push those thoughts away. She had work to do. The morning air was crisp when she arrived at King Enterprises. The building was as intimidating as ever, looming high over the city, its mirrored glass exterior reflecting the morning sun like a fortress. Claire took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and stepped inside. "Morning, Claire." She turned to see Jake grinning at her from the reception desk. "You survived your first day." "That's an achievement," he teased. Claire managed a small smile. "Barely." Jake chuckled. "Yeah, well, don't get too comfortable. Adrian isn't exactly the kind of boss who makes things easy. Tell me something I don't know." Claire forced a casual shrug. "I can handle it." Jake raised an eyebrow. "I like the confidence. Come on, I'll walk you up." She followed him to the elevator, her mind racing. She had to be smarter. She couldn't let Adrian get too close. If she played this carefully, she could fade into the background, do her job, and make sure she never had to have another one-on-one conversation with him again. But the moment she stepped into the office, her plan fell apart, because waiting at her desk was a message. A handwritten note written on thick, expensive paper. "My office now, Adrian." Her stomach dropped. Jake whistled when he saw it. "Yikes, King doesn't usually send personal notes. You must have really made an impression." Claire forced a tight smile. "Lucky me." She grabbed the note and walked toward Adrian's office, her pulse hammering. Why was he calling her in? What did he want? She knocked once. "Come in," came the low, commanding voice from inside. Claire pushed the door open and stepped into the lion's den. Adrian was sitting behind his massive glass-topped desk. He didn't look up immediately, just continued reviewing a document in front of him. The room was too quiet, and that made her nervous. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Adrian lifted his head and looked at her. "Close the door, Claire." Her breath caught. Everything inside her screamed not to listen, but she had no choice. She slowly shut the door, and suddenly it was just the two of them, alone in a room that felt far too small. Adrian leaned back in his chair, studying her with an unreadable expression. "Why did you apply here?" Claire froze. That wasn't what she had expected. She swallowed. "I needed a job. Your company had an opening." His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smirk. "Right. Just a coincidence." She kept her expression neutral. "Yes." Adrian was silent for a long time. Then, without breaking eye contact, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. You're lying. Claire's stomach twisted into knots. She forced herself to keep her voice calm. I'm not. Adrian's gaze darkened. I don't believe in coincidences, Claire. Her heart pounded. Believe whatever you want, she said quietly. But I'm here to do my job, that's all. Adrian didn't reply right away. He just watched her. And then, after an eternity, he let out a slow breath. Fine, he said. Claire exhaled, relieved. Maybe, just maybe, he would let this go. But then his next words shattered that hope. If I find out you're hiding something from me, he murmured, his voice dangerously soft, there will be consequences. Claire felt a chill crawl down her spine. She didn't respond. She just turned and walked out, keeping her head high, her back straight. But deep down, she knew. This wasn't over, not even close, and by the time lunch rolled around, Claire was exhausted. She needed air. She made her way to the rooftop garden, a quiet space employees sometimes use to escape the madness of the office. The moment she stepped outside, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Fresh air, finally. But before she could enjoy the peace, she heard footsteps behind her. Thought I'd find you here. She turned sharply. Jake, Claire gave him a tired smile. Do I look that predictable? Jake smirked. A little, but mostly you look stressed. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. It's been, a long day. Jake sat on the bench beside her. Adrian giving you a hard time? Claire hesitated. She barely knew Jake. She couldn't exactly tell him the truth. So she just shrugged. He's intense. Jake laughed. That's an understatement, but you'll get used to it. Claire wasn't so sure. Jake leaned back, staring at the sky. You know, he wasn't always like this. She glanced at him. What do you mean? Jake sighed. Adrian, he used to be different before everything happened. Claire stiffened. What happened? Jake hesitated, then, after a long pause, he shrugged. No one really knows. One day, he just changed. Became the ruthless guy we all know now. Claire looked away, her chest tightening. She already knew what happened. She happened, their one night together. And then she had disappeared, and now? Now, she was standing right in front of him, lying through her teeth, pretending nothing had ever happened. A sharp gust of wind blew through the rooftop, making her shiver. Jake noticed. Come on, let's head back inside before you freeze. Claire nodded and stood up. But as she walked toward the door, a terrifying thought settled in her mind. Adrian was already suspicious. It was only a matter of time before he uncovered the truth. And when he did, she wasn't sure if she was ready for what came next. Section 7. Claire barely made it through the rest of the workday without unraveling. Adrian's words still echoed in her mind. If I find out you're hiding something from me, there will be consequences. She knew what that meant. Adrian never let things go, and if he had even the slightest suspicion that she was keeping something from him, he would tear through every wall she had built to find the truth. By the time the office emptied for the evening, Claire felt like she had been holding her breath all day. She needed to get home to Elliot, but just as she reached for her bag, her phone buzzed. A message from Adrian. My office now. Her stomach dropped. For a brief moment she considered ignoring it, pretending she hadn't seen it. But she knew that would only make things worse. With a deep breath, she forced herself to walk toward his office. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor, the sound almost deafening in the quiet corridor. This late, most employees had already left, which meant she was walking straight into a trap. When she reached his office, she hesitated for only a second before knocking. Come in. His voice was low, steady. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Adrian was sitting behind his desk, his dark eyes locked onto her the second she entered. For a long moment, he didn't say anything, just watched her, like he was studying her. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. Close the door. Claire swallowed hard. Something about the way he said it sent a chill through her. But she did as he said, shutting the door softly behind her. Then she turned to face him. Is there a problem, Mr. King? She asked, keeping her voice as neutral as possible. Adrian's lips twitched. Mr. King? He echoed, his tone amused. That's what we're doing now? Claire kept her expression blank. That's your name, isn't it? A small smirk played on his lips, but his eyes remained unreadable. You tell me, Claire. Silence filled the room. Her pulse pounded. She needed to be careful. Adrian was digging. He was testing her, waiting for her to slip. After a long pause, he finally spoke again. You've been working here for a couple of days now, he mused. And yet, I can't seem to shake the feeling that you're Out of place. Claire's heart stopped. She forced herself to hold his gaze. I'm qualified for this job. I never said you weren't, Adrian murmured. But there's something about you, Claire. Something familiar. Her breath hitched. He was getting closer. She had to stop this. So she switched tactics. If you think I'm unqualified, you can fire me, she said coolly. Adrian's eyes flashed. A slow, dark smile curled on his lips. Oh, Claire, he murmured. I never said I wanted to fire you. A shiver ran down her spine. Adrian leaned forward, his elbows resting on his desk. But I do have a question, he said softly. Claire forced herself to breathe evenly. Go ahead. Adrian tilted his head. Have we met before? Claire's stomach plummeted. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to lie, to deny everything. But Adrian was too smart for that. If she denied it too quickly, too aggressively, he would know she was hiding something. So instead she played dumb. I don't think so, she said lightly, unless you frequent coffee shops on the east side of the city, because that's where I used to work. Adrian's gaze darkened slightly. That's not what I meant. Claire shrugged, forcing herself to appear unaffected. I don't know what to tell you, Mr. King. Adrian didn't respond right away. He just watched her, studied her. Then, finally, he exhaled. All right, Claire, he murmured. You can go. Claire blinked. She hadn't expected him to drop it so easily, but she wasn't about to question it. She turned toward the door, her heart still racing. But before she could reach the handle, Adrian spoke again. One last thing. She froze. Her fingers tightened around her bag. She turned back slowly. Yes? Adrian's gaze burned into her. You have a son, don't you? Claire's world tilted, her lungs locked. The entire room spun. She barely managed to keep her voice steady. Why do you ask? Adrian leaned back, watching her closely. I saw you yesterday, he said casually, with a little boy. Claire's hands went ice cold. Adrian knew, or at least he suspected. She needed to stay calm. She needed to think fast. Yes, she admitted. I have a son. Adrian's expression didn't change. How old is he? Her breath caught. Why was he asking that? Was he putting the pieces together? 3, she said carefully. Adrian's jaw tightened. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in his eyes. Something dark. But it was gone before she could read it. 3, he repeated slowly. Claire's heart thundered in her chest. She knew exactly what he was thinking. She knew he was doing the math in his head. If Elliot was 3 years old, that meant she had been pregnant right after their night together. Adrian didn't look away, didn't blink. The air in the room was suffocating. Finally, he exhaled, running a hand through his hair. All right, Claire, he murmured. You can go. Claire didn't hesitate. She turned immediately, gripping the door handle so tightly her knuckles turned white. And then she stepped out, closing the door behind her. The second she was in the hallway, she let out a shaky breath. Her hands trembled. She had barely escaped. But it was too close, too close. Adrian knew something was off. And now, more than ever, she knew it was only a matter of time before he uncovered the truth. Section 8. Claire barely made it back to her desk before her knees almost gave out beneath her. Her hands still trembled, and her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Adrian suspected something. The way he had looked at her, the way he had pressed her for details, it wasn't just casual curiosity. He was putting the pieces together, and when he did, she had no idea what would happen. She collapsed into her chair, taking a deep, shaky breath. She needed to think. She had survived this encounter, but it was clear that Adrian wasn't going to let this go. Sooner or later, he would find out the truth, and when he did, there would be no going back. A small voice in her head whispered that she should just tell him the truth. Tell him that Elliot was his son, that for 3 years she had raised his child alone, that she had gone through every milestone, his first steps, his first words, his first fever, without Adrian by her side. But what good would that do? Adrian was a powerful man, a ruthless man. If she told him the truth, he wouldn't just accept it and walk away. He would want control. He would demand to be in Elliot's life, and that was the one thing Claire couldn't risk. Because what if Adrian decided that he wanted full custody? What if he decided to use his power, his influence, his wealth to take Elliot away from her? The thought alone was enough to make her stomach churn. She wouldn't let that happen. She had to protect her son, no matter what. She took another deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. For now, Adrian only had suspicions. She could still control the situation. But she had to be careful. She couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Just as she was trying to steady herself, her phone buzzed. A message from her babysitter. "Hey, Claire, sorry to bother you, but Elliot has been feeling a little warm since this morning. I think he might have a slight fever. Should I give him some medicine?" Claire's heart dropped. Elliot was sick? She immediately typed a response. "Yes, please give him some children's Tylenol. I'll try to come home early today." Her hands shook as she sent the message. She needed to leave. She needed to be with Elliot. Her son was her priority, but how was she supposed to walk out of here early when Adrian already had his eyes on her? She bit her lip, weighing her options. If she suddenly asked for an emergency leave, Adrian would only get more suspicious. She needed to do this carefully. Forcing herself to stand, she smoothed out her skirt and walked toward her supervisor's office. When she stepped inside, her supervisor, a kind but firm woman named Janet, looked up in surprise. "Claire?" Janet blinked. "Something wrong?" Claire nodded, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I just got a message from my babysitter," she explained. "My son has a fever, and I was wondering if I could leave an hour early to check on him." Janet's face softened immediately. "Oh, of course," she said. "Family comes first. Just make sure you finish up your pending work before you go." Relief washed over Claire. "Thank you so much, Janet." "Of course," Janet said with a small smile. "I hope your little one feels better soon." Claire gave a grateful nod before heading back to her desk. 1 hour. She just had to get through 1 more hour. She focused on wrapping up her tasks as quickly as possible, but she could still feel Adrian's eyes on her. Every time she glanced toward his office, she saw him standing by the glass wall, his gaze locked on her. He was watching, waiting, and Claire knew that she was running out of time. Finally, when the hour was up, she grabbed her bag and made her way toward the elevator. But just as the doors were about to close, a hand shot out and stopped them. Adrian stepped inside. Claire's breath hitched, the doors slid shut, and suddenly she was trapped in a small space with the one man she was desperately trying to avoid. Adrian didn't say anything at first, just stood there, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. The silence was thick, suffocating. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "You're leaving early," he said. It wasn't a question, it was an observation. Claire swallowed hard. "Yes," she said carefully. "I have some personal matters to take care of." Adrian tilted his head slightly. "Your son?" Her pulse raced. "Yes," she admitted. Adrian's jaw tensed. She could see the thoughts racing behind his dark eyes. Then he did something unexpected. He reached out and pressed the emergency stop button. The elevator jerked to a halt. Claire's breath caught. "Adrian, you're hiding something from me, Claire," he said, his voice low and controlled. She forced herself to stay calm. "I don't know what you're talking about." Adrian took a step closer. "You disappeared after that night," he murmured. "Vanished without a trace." Claire's heart hammered. "I moved on," she said firmly, "just like you did." Adrian's eyes darkened. "Did you?" he asked softly. She hated how his voice sent a shiver down her spine. "Yes," she whispered. Adrian studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen once, then turned it toward her. Claire's blood froze. It was a picture of her and Elliot, taken from afar. Adrian's voice was barely above a whisper. "This was taken yesterday," he said. "And unless I'm going crazy, that little boy looks an awful lot like me." Claire couldn't breathe. She was caught, trapped. There was no denying it now. Adrian knew. Her mind raced. She had 2 options. She could lie, or she could tell him the truth. Either way, nothing would ever be the same again. Section 9. Claire felt the world around her shrink, her chest tightening as she stared at the image on Adrian's phone. Elliot's small frame, his messy curls, his deep brown eyes that mirrored Adrian's so unmistakably it was undeniable. Her breath shuddered. Adrian knew, and he was waiting for her to confirm it, to say the words that would change everything. But Claire's mind raced with panic. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't lose control. She forced herself to stay composed even as every instinct screamed at her to run. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian's jaw clenched. "Don't do this, Claire," he said quietly. "Don't lie to me." She lifted her chin. "I'm not lying." Adrian's grip on his phone tightened, his knuckles turning white. "That boy looks exactly like me," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "And I want to know why." Claire's stomach churned. This was it. This was the moment she had feared for years. She had managed to hide Elliot from Adrian for so long, but now the truth was standing right in front of them. Adrian took another step closer, his gaze unwavering. "Tell me the truth," he said. "Is he mine?" Claire's breath hitched. She had spent years preparing for this possibility. She had rehearsed excuses, reasons, explanations. But now that she was face to face with the inevitable, she felt her strength crumbling. She couldn't lie anymore. Not when Adrian was this close to the truth. Not when he wouldn't stop until he had answers. She looked away, her body trembling. "Yes," she finally whispered. The words shattered the silence between them. Adrian stilled. His breath caught. For a long moment he didn't move, didn't blink, didn't react, and then he let out a shaky exhale. As in, his voice was hoarse, as if he couldn't believe he was saying the words. As in, "He's my son." Claire swallowed hard. "Yes," she said again. Adrian let out a low curse under his breath, running a hand through his hair. He staggered back, leaning against the wall of the stopped elevator. His entire world had just shifted. "How long?" he asked, his voice raw. Claire hesitated. "How long have you known?" he demanded, his eyes dark and unreadable. Claire bit her lip, her stomach twisting in knots. "Since the moment I found out I was pregnant," she admitted. Adrian's jaw tightened. "And you never told me?" Claire flinched at the sharpness of his tone. "I didn't think you'd care," she said softly. Adrian's eyes flashed with anger. "Didn't think I'd—" He exhaled harshly, clenching his fists at his sides. "Claire, he's my son." Claire flinched again. "You left," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian froze. "You disappeared," she continued, her voice shaking. "You didn't call. You didn't text. You didn't—" Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to keep going. "I waited, Adrian, and you never came back." A heavy silence filled the space between them. Adrian stared at her, his expression unreadable. And then, in the quietest voice she had ever heard from him, he asked, "Why didn't you come find me?" Claire let out a bitter laugh. "Find you?" she repeated. "You were the one who left. You made it clear what we had meant nothing to you. You were gone before I even woke up that morning." Adrian winced as if her words physically hurt him. "Claire, Do you know how hard it was?" she interrupted, her voice breaking. "Do you know what it was like, carrying a child alone, giving birth alone, raising him alone?" Adrian's face paled. She shook her head. "You don't, because you weren't there." A heavy silence fell between them again, and for the first time Claire saw something in Adrian's expression that she had never seen before. Regret. Real, aching regret, but she didn't care. It was too late for apologies. Adrian exhaled sharply. "I should have known," he said under his breath. "I should have looked for you." Claire turned away, tears burning her eyes. "It doesn't matter anymore." Adrian stiffened. "It does," he said. "It matters." Claire squeezed her eyes shut, trying to steady her breathing. But then, Adrian's next words sent a chill down her spine. "I want to meet him." Her eyes flew open. "What?" she whispered. Adrian's gaze hardened. "He's my son, Claire," he said firmly, "and I want to meet him." Claire's stomach dropped. "No," she said immediately. Adrian's jaw tightened. "Claire, no," she repeated, backing away. "You don't get to just walk in and demand this. You don't get to claim him after all these years." Adrian's eyes darkened. "I have a right to know him," he said. "You lost that right," Claire snapped. Adrian's expression turned cold. "Then I'll fight for it," he said, "legally if I have to." Claire went still. A wave of fear crashed over her. He wouldn't, would he? She looked into his steely gaze and her blood ran cold. He absolutely would. Adrian King was not the kind of man who backed down from something he wanted. And right now he wanted his son. She could see it in his eyes, feel it in the air between them. He wasn't going to let this go. Claire felt her chest tighten. This was her worst nightmare coming true. Adrian wasn't walking away, he was digging in. And she had no idea how to stop him. Section 10. Claire stood frozen, her body tense, her mind racing with possibilities. Adrian's words echoed in her head, words that shattered her carefully constructed life. He was serious. He wanted to fight for Elliot. Her heart pounded violently against her rib cage. This wasn't just a threat, this was Adrian King. A man who didn't just take no for an answer. A man who had built an empire with sheer willpower and determination. And now he had set his sights on his son. Claire felt a wave of panic grip her, but she quickly masked it, forcing herself to stay calm. She couldn't let Adrian see how much this rattled her. "You can't just demand to be part of his life now," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "That's not how this works." Adrian's eyes were cold, unreadable. "That's exactly how this works." Claire clenched her fists. "You weren't there when I needed you," she shot back. "You weren't there when he took his first steps or spoke his first word. You weren't there for the sleepless nights, the fevers, the birthdays." Her voice cracked, but she refused to back down. "You have no idea what it's been like, Adrian. And now you suddenly think you have a right to him?" Adrian's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, something almost pained. "You never gave me a chance to be there," he said quietly. Claire let out a bitter laugh. "Are you serious? You left. You didn't call, you didn't text. What was I supposed to think?" Adrian inhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. "I made mistakes," he admitted. "I won't deny that. But I didn't know. If I had—" His jaw tightened. "If I had known, I never would have left." Claire stared at him, her heart aching in ways she hadn't expected. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that if he had known about Elliot, things would have been different. But believing that wouldn't change the past. Believing that wouldn't erase the years of struggle and loneliness. "You can't change what happened," she whispered. Adrian exhaled. "But I can change what happens next." Claire shook her head. "It's not that simple." "It is," Adrian insisted. "He's my son, Claire. I want to know him. I want him to know me." She hated how her heart clenched at his words. Hated that a part of her wanted to let him in. But she had spent years building walls to keep him out. Could she really let him walk back in now? Could she trust him not to leave again? She didn't know, and that terrified her. Silence hung heavy between them, stretching on for what felt like eternity. Finally, Adrian spoke again, his voice softer this time. "I don't want to take him away from you," he said. I just want a chance." Claire swallowed hard, her defenses wavering. A chance. Could she give him that? Would it be fair to Elliot if she didn't? She took a deep breath, her entire body tense. "If I agree to this," she said slowly, "it has to be on my terms." Adrian's eyes flickered with something. Hope. "What terms?" Claire crossed her arms. "You don't just get to walk in and claim him. We take this slow. You start by meeting him as a friend, not his father. And if I see that you're serious about this, then we'll talk about telling him the truth." Adrian was silent for a long moment, then, "Okay," he said. Claire's breath hitched. He agreed, just like that. She had expected him to argue, to push back, to demand more. But he had agreed. And for some reason, that scared her even more. The first meeting was tense. Claire had spent the entire morning overthinking everything, wondering if she was making a mistake. Elliot was excited. A little too excited. He had no idea who Adrian really was. But the idea of meeting Mommy's new friend had him buzzing with curiosity. "Is he nice?" Elliot asked as they walked toward the cafe. Claire hesitated. "I think so." Elliot scrunched his nose. "That doesn't sound convincing." Claire let out a nervous laugh. "You'll see for yourself." When they reached the cafe, Adrian was already there, sitting at a corner table. He looked different, more relaxed, less like the intimidating CEO she had met in the office. But there was still something in his eyes, something intense, something unreadable. Claire's heart pounded as she led Elliot over. "Hi," Elliot greeted cheerfully. Adrian stared at him. For a long, silent moment he didn't speak, he just looked, like he was trying to memorize every detail, like he was trying to convince himself this was real. Then finally, "Hey, kid," Adrian said, his voice oddly soft. Elliot grinned. "Mom says you're her friend." Adrian's lips twitched. "Yeah, I guess I am." Claire let out the breath she didn't realize she was holding. The tension eased just a little. The first meeting went better than expected. Adrian was careful, patient. He asked Elliot about school, about his favorite things. And Elliot, completely unaware of the weight of the situation, chatted away happily. For the first time, Claire wondered. Maybe this could work. Maybe Adrian really did want to be there for Elliot. Maybe she couldn't let herself hope too much, not yet. Not when she knew how much hope could hurt. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into something more. Adrian became a constant presence. He showed up every single time. And little by little, Claire felt the walls around her crack. It was terrifying. It was dangerous. Because the more she saw him with Elliot, the harder it was to hate him. One night, after putting Elliot to bed, she found Adrian standing outside her apartment, waiting, watching. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian took a step closer. "You know why." Her heart pounded. "I didn't just lose Elliot, Claire," he said. "I lost you too." Claire looked away. "That was your choice," she whispered. Adrian exhaled sharply. "I know, and I regret it every damn day." Silence, and then, "Tell me what I have to do," Adrian said. Claire's breath hitched. "Tell me what I have to do to fix this." Tears burned her eyes. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that he wouldn't leave this time, but could she? Could she really trust him again? "I don't know," she admitted. Adrian took another step forward, closing the space between them. "Then let me prove it to you," he said. Claire felt something inside her break. She didn't answer. She didn't know if she could. But for the first time, and she thought maybe, just maybe, she wanted to let him try. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. What would you do in Claire's situation? Let us know in the comments. Let us know in the comments. Let us know in the comments.